Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another Soothkeep live stream. I'm actually looking forward to this live stream more than general, and I do generally love doing the live streams. So I just want to right at the off the bat, just first of all, give me a thumbs up if you guys can see me and hear me. But off of the bat, I just want to explain something about my ministry that I'm sure those of you that have been listening to me for a while are already familiar with, but those that are newer, you need to understand this so you'll never understand my ministry. I teach on a lot of topics, but no message is just for the message itself. I almost never teach a message that the message itself is the whole kit and caboodle. Behind every message, my fundamental underlying motive is to present sound methodology, the historical grammatical hermeneutic, sound handling of the scriptures that's going to be consistent with history, that's going to be consistent with grammar, that's going to be consistent with the context, that's going to be consistent with the Bible testimony as a whole, which we call the analogy of faith. And this is my heart cry, because if you can convince someone on one doctrine, you've just convinced them on one doctrine and that's it. If you can convince them to be stronger and more consistent in a proper methodology in the historical grammatical hermeneutic, then in principle you win them to everything they're supposed to believe. Now, obviously we're all weak and we all stumble forwards in this matter, and nobody's going to get to heaven and find out that they were right on 100% of every issue that we take up. But we can make a huge difference in how much truth we embrace in the course of our discipleship by pursuing with our whole heart sound methodology. And so really, this message tonight on the moon landing, and I'll go into this more in a few minutes, but this message is, though it is directly addressing the moon landing and its historicity or its falsity, but behind this message, the most important message, and more important than this, the moon landing, is how we handle evidence. That's everything, folks. If you learn to handle evidence, in theory, you can be right on every issue you touch. If you are inconsistent in your handling of evidence, inconsistent in your study of it, inconsistent in your gathering of it, inconsistent in your embracing of it, then you're guaranteed right off the bat to be wrong on some issues. Well, anyway, this is a Soothkeep live stream. My mission is truth that God will own as truth at the judgment seat of Christ, truth in our doctrine, our practice, and our discernment, and truth that's derived by a robust and consistent application of the historical grammatical hermeneutic. A couple minutes of housekeeping, and then we're going to get into the message. We're going forth with our potential move here. Well, it's not a potential move at this point. We are moving. So we haven't sold our house in North Dakota. And we haven't yet closed on the house in Oklahoma, but it's definitely going in that direction. Very, very favorable. We have lined up a U-Haul truck that we're going to pick up on Sunday, August 31st, and we're going to load it that afternoon. And theoretically, we're leaving on Monday, September 1st, giving ourselves 3 days to take a nice, slow, lazy drive to Oklahoma. In theory, we're going to sign on September the 4th for the house, close for it, and then we move in. So that's where things are at. But I want you to continue to pray for us, folks, that this move goes smoothly, that there's no hitches, no glitches, and just pray that God would continue to bless and use me in his work. Now, this is the message. The moon landing, is it a hoax or is it historical fact? I find it very fascinating that historically, the vast majority of Americans believed the moon landing was a historical fact. Um, you know, there was, I forget what year it came out, but it was, I can't remember, it was late 90s or early 2000s. There was a something that Fox TV did on the moon landing. And one of the numbers that was thrown around was that there was maybe 20% of Americans at that time that didn't believe in the moon landing is as a fact of history, that it was a hoax. But people that actually work with numbers and polls were very skeptical of that number that had been booted around. And they figured the number was probably closer to 6 or 7% of Americans at that time rejected the moon landing. Now, I don't think that's the case now. I think the number has been skyrocketing in the last few years. Everywhere I go, people are taking up the moon landing as a hoax story. So let me introduce why I'm going to handle this. Obviously, if we're going to compare this issue to major things like the gospel or dispensational truth or the fundamental doctrines of the faith, then this is a minor issue. Now, people often say, well, why would you take this up? It's a minor issue. Can we be consistent here? Typically, I notice when people want to raise that kind of issue with me, they're already themselves watching flat earth videos, or they're watching that we didn't go to the moon videos. Why would you think it's okay for you to watch people teaching the other side, and it's not okay for me to teach my side? This seems very inconsistent. It seems like it goes against the grain of iron sharpens iron. So yes, this is a little issue if you're comparing it to the big issues. And you can believe in a flat earth, and you can believe in the moon landing is a hoax and still go to heaven. This is not a salvation issue. But we're not obligated as believers to teach only on salvation issues. We teach on prophecy all the time. That's not a salvation issue. We teach on eternal security versus falling away all the time. That's not a salvation issue. I'm not a Calvinist. I believe Calvinism is wrong, but Calvinism is not a salvation issue. I don't believe in falling away Arminianism, but you can be a falling away Arminian and still be in heaven. In fact, you will be in heaven if you're born again. So we shouldn't be throwing around this idea that we shouldn't teach on anything unless it's salvation, because as soon as we start going down that path, we're going to find ourselves on a path where we're stepping on our own toes as well as everybody else's. We have an obligation to take up subjects other than salvation truth, because the Bible takes up issues other than immediate salvation truth. Now, the real issue here is methodology. That's why I'm teaching this message. I am noticing on doctrinal issues, on issues like the King James only issue, the flat earth issue, on this issue, on the Hebrew roots issue, on all kinds of issues, people are walking away from sound methodology. All false doctrine and all corrupt science like evolution and all corrupt history is taught and defended with the exact same bad methodology. There's really only two camps in the world when it comes to evidence. There's the camp that will weigh all the evidence, put all the evidence in one big pile, and sift the evidence until it comes to a position that harmonizes all the evidence. That's the minority camp. On any issue you look at, that's the minority camp. Most people, when they weigh issues, they favor a small pile of evidence, and they run with that pile of evidence, and they reject all the rest of the evidence that challenges their position. This is called the selective use of evidence. Now, I'm bringing this up dealing with the moon landing, because here we're dealing with something that's not a salvation issue. It's not one of our main doctrinal issues. And yet it's very easy to illustrate methodology with it. And by that token, it's important that we do address methodology on issues like this. Because if a person is going to employ bad methodology on an issue like the moon landing, you can rest assured that this is not one stray dog roaming by itself. If people allow bad methodology in one area of their own personal investigation and research, you can guarantee that dog is not running alone. It is running with other dogs. This is not the only issue where they have bad methodology. I've observed over and over again when people go down one of the doctrinal issues, which I regard as rabbit holes, it doesn't take long and they go down a second, a third, or a fourth. Once you learn to go down, chase the rabbits down the rabbit holes, it's hard to break that habit. So this is really, even though it's not directly Christian doctrine, and it's definitely not salvation, it is really a significant matter of discernment for believers. I'm watching believers all around the globe on social media and in the YouTube sphere embracing ideas that are not based on all the evidence. They're based on a dogma, and they're based on a selective use of evidence. So anyway, let's dive into this. We're going to start with a few remarks on methodology. I'm going to address the difference between investigation and doubting. Now, hopefully, some of you will get your eyes opened when I address the difference between investigation and doubting. They are not the same thing. I'm going to explain how evidence works when we're dealing with history. And then we're going to look at 19 commonly raised pieces of evidence that the US never went to the moon. And we're also going to take up and look at 19 very reasonable explanations for each one of these points of evidence. So I encourage you, hang with me all the way. Even if you think I'm a knothead and no discernment because I am gullible enough to believe that we went to the moon, hang with me. Weigh the evidence with me. Because if you are correct, you will be able to see right through the evidence I present. In fact, most people will see right through it. But I think you're going to find that the evidence is very, very strong that we did go to the moon. So let's go to methodology. Folks, methodology is your first priority. This is 10 times more important for you than any other issue than the fact of your salvation. If your methodology for research and investigation is wrong, the odds are very high that you're going to be wrong on that issue, and you're going to be wrong on a lot of other issues. Now, what methodology should we use? Obviously, the scientific method. There is no other legit methodology. The scientific method, we talk about it a little bit different depending upon what field we're in. So I'm going to step back just a little bit and give the generic understanding of it that applies to every field and not just this particular field. The scientific method is observational science. It's observational science that gathers all of the evidence and rejects every solution, which cannot harmonize all the evidence. And it searches for a solution that harmonizes all the evidence. Folks, this is exactly the same whether you're looking at flat Earth or whether or not we went to the moon, or whether you're looking at falling away versus eternal security, or looking at pre-trib versus post-trib. It doesn't matter what issue you're looking at. The methodology is exactly the same. Now, this scientific method here of observational science, it's applicable in every field. It's in exegesis, in theology, in history, in grammar, in archaeology, in scientific investigation, in every field. Now, the opposite of the scientific method, we can call the preconception method. And by the way, many a person that claims to be following the scientific method is not following the scientific method. They're following the preconception method. Evolution is not objective science. Evolution is not observational science. Evolution is a preconceived theory. It's a preconception method. Now, if you're taking the preconception method, then you're starting your investigation with a prejudice for one side or against the other. You're going to come to the table with controlling preconceptions, controlling presuppositions, and they're going to decide the question before you even investigate. They're going to sift the evidence, and it's going to reject all the evidence that disagrees with your starting point. Now, folks, I want you to picture in your mind just a big pile of evidence. Let's say it's the size of a big dump truck pile of gravel, and you got thousands of pieces of evidence in that pile. Would it be legit to go through that pile and gather out 2 buckets, 5-gallon pails of little quartz pieces and pull them aside and then say the pile is quartz, and reject everyone that points to the pile and says, well, there's also sandstone and limestone in this pile, and there's some granite, and there's some other stones? Oh, no, look here's 2 buckets. These 2 buckets right here. These 2 buckets are quartz. Therefore, the whole pile is quartz. When you think of that example, it seems hilarious that anyone would do that. And we don't do that in the normal everyday life, but we do it all the time when it comes to science and doctrine and theology and conspiracy theories. We make a selective use of evidence. We pick and choose what evidence we're going to accept, and we reject everything that disagrees with that. So, folks, you have a God-given obligation to seek all the evidence on the subject, to weigh all the evidence on the subject, and trust the conclusion that the evidence forces you to. This and this alone is God-honoring science, and doing anything else is just not God-honoring. Now, related to the question of methodology is the question of investigation versus radical doubting. This is more a matter of spirit than method. But folks, a wrong spirit leads to wrong method. It just works that way. So what's the distinction between investigation and radical doubting? Well, a spirit of investigation examines all the evidence and arguments on both sides, and it has no prejudice for one side or the other. It doesn't care where the evidence leads it. But a spirit of radical doubt is unreasonable doubt that examines an issue influenced by a wave of popular doubt, and it skews heavily to the one side. Now, this kind of doubt doubts things that are already established by history and evidence. It doubts established things as if they were dubious things. It doubts traditional views just because they're traditional. And it carries a heavy rhetorical punch because it brands itself as independent thinking and critical thinking and not being a blind follower. But if you're not weighing all the evidence, then your claims of being an independent thinker and a critical thinker are just gaslighting, and you're guilty of the very thing you're accusing others of doing. Now, we definitely want a spirit of investigation, but we don't want a spirit of radical doubt. A spirit of radical doubt is just as dangerous as a spirit of blind faith and credulity. We don't want either one of these. We're trying to be in the middle and avoid this stuff. All right, well, let's move on to the evidence as it involves in history. This will only take a minute, and then we're going to look at the 19 evidences against the moon landing. not the only 19, but I looked at a whole bunch of them and I picked 19 that were the most commonly given. Uh, in this whole batch of 19, virtually everybody that claims the moon landing is a hoax is going to take up 10, 12, or 15 of these arguments. So we're focusing on the moon landing, folks. This is a matter of history. So we're going to approach this as if we're approaching history. Now, the way this works, just as a man is innocent until he's proven guilty, so history is correct until proven incorrect. You can't flip this. You can't reverse it. If you're going to reverse this, you're guilty of the same thing that many of the leftist liberals are doing, where a man is guilty until proven innocent. We cannot do that. History, folks, is not overthrown. It's not challenged at all just because folks have doubts. And history isn't overthrown or even challenged just because people raise quibbles, especially not when the quibbles are easily answered. History is only overthrown if men present strong facts, not difficulties, strong facts to the contrary. As long as they don't have that, general operating procedure is alleged history is to be regarded as true history until it's proven otherwise. Now, when we examine this pile of evidence against the moon landing, do we find a pile of incontrovertible facts which destroy the moon landing as a point of history? Or do we find something that's significantly less convincing? One more thought on this. What's the burden of proof here? The burden of proof is not on those who believe that we went to the moon. We're under no obligation to prove that we went to the moon. We're under no obligation to prove that we went to the moon than we are to prove that George Washington was the first president of the United States, or to prove that Napoleon lost at Waterloo. There's a tremendous amount of history here that's been accepted broadly and widely for a wide number of reasons. And just because someone doubts that Napoleon lost at Waterloo, or just because someone doubts that George Washington was the first president of the United States, doesn't throw any real challenge to the face of history. So the burden is not on me to prove that we went to the moon. 50 years of history has already proven the point. It's already established the point. The burden of proof is on the doubters to prove beyond all shadow of doubt that we didn't go to the moon. Now, if I or anybody else can give reasonable answers to the supposed evidence of the doubters, then the moon landing must be retained as history. And if reasonable answers are provided to the supposed evidences that raise the doubts, then if people don't accept those reasonable answers, they demonstrate that they're not moved by the scientific method or facts of science. They're moved by a prejudice which is unreasonable. So let's move on to the 19 evidences against the moon landing. And I'm going to give, for each one of these, there's going to be a simple common sense explanation. So the first one, and this is the one that you see the most, the waving flag proves that the picture was shot on Earth. Folks, it's not even close. First of all, if you had intelligent men attempting to fake the moon landing, they would have thought, wait a minute, there's no atmosphere in the moon, so there's no wind on the moon, and there's almost no gravity on the moon. So we got to make sure that when we put up a flag, it looks like it's a windless, atmosphereless, low gravity environment. They would have done this very differently if they were attempting to fake the moon landing. To put up a flag, if you're trying to fake the moon landing and you put up a flag that's flapping in the wind, an intelligent sixth grade student can see right through that. Okay, now, but here's the thing. The ruffles that you can clearly see in many a moon landing picture do not require wind, and they are readily explained by other factors. First of all, folks, the flag was intentionally designed to stick out and proudly show the stars and stripes. They had a horizontal pole that was attached to the vertical pole that held the flag out. And on top of that, that horizontal pole was intentionally shorter than the flag so that the flag would have a few natural furrows in it. They knew that people are used to seeing the flag stick out, and they wanted to show the stars and stripes. Now, as far as the flag moving, this is also easy to explain. When you have one astronaut twisting the pole and the other one on the flag side, that you're twisting the pole, trying to sink that flagpole into the surface of the moon. Just the movement of the flagpole and the flag is going to make the flag flutter. It's to be noted that when you look at the pictures in the video clips, the flag doesn't move unless either the flag or the flagpole is being touched by an astronaut. The air isn't moving the flag. This is pretty obvious because when there's nobody around it, it's not moving. It just sits in the same position that it was in. Now, here's another interesting thing. If the extension of the flag is due to the wind blowing hard enough to straighten the flag, how come there's not clouds of dust in the picture? Seriously, folks. The dust on the moon is almost as fine as talcum powder. If there was a wind blowing hard enough to blow that flag the way it looks in the picture, then you would see clouds of dust blowing around the astronauts. This really, folks, this is just a classic example that the more you investigate the claims of the deniers, the weaker those arguments get. Well, let's move on to the second argument. The lack of stars in the sky in the photos proves that they were shot here on Earth and probably on a set. No, not at all. Not even close. This is a basic misunderstanding of camera exposure settings. Now, on Earth, the atmosphere scatters the sunlight during the day, and that brightens the sky so you can't see the stars. Now, on the moon, there's no atmosphere to reflect the sunlight up into the heavens during the day. So on the moon, the sky is dark even during the day. Now, of course, that raises the question, if the sky is dark during the day, how come we don't see stars in the moon photos? It's simply a matter of camera exposure. That's all it is. When they were taking these pictures, the sun was typically low on the lunar horizon. It's a lunar morning. And the sun is shining brightly off the lunar surface. And the lunar surface reflects quite a bit of the light of the sun. And plus, their white spacesuits are brilliantly lit. So if you're going to take a picture of a bright object, like something that's bright white, and you're going to take that picture when the surrounding environment immediately in front of it and to the side of it and behind it is also bright, then you have to set your exposure time to very fast, and you have to partially or largely close the aperture, depending upon how much brightness you're dealing with. When you're Closing the aperture, just think it's like squinting when you're looking at the sun. That's the same kind of thing. You squint your eyelids when you're looking at the in bright light, and you close the aperture when you're trying to take a photograph in bright light. Now, it just is a matter of fact that the stars during the day in the moon, they're dimmer than the stars on Earth at night because there is a little light there. It's not the sky's not quite as dark as it is on Earth. Now, but if you were to shoot photos of the heavens at night here on planet Earth using the same aperture settings and the same super fast exposure settings that they were using when they shot the pictures on the moon, you'd get the same results. You would only see the brightest stars in the heavens. You wouldn't see the dim stars. The dim stars are not going to register. If you're going to photograph stars, you need to have a longer exposure and a wider aperture. If you're going to photograph faint stars, you need even a longer exposure yet and a wider aperture. The Apollo Hasselblad cameras had their exposure and shutter speed set so that they could capture objects with a bright foreground and a bright background. And they were photographing the white astronaut spacesuits and the shiny lunar lander. They had to have the exposure settings set so that they wouldn't overexpose the picture they're trying to take. And when they did that, the stars that were faint are not going to show up. So this is just simply a matter of basic photography. Anyone that actually is a real photographer will understand what I'm saying. If you don't understand what I'm saying, just look up exposure and do a little Google research on photography and exposure, and then do a little bit more on the photography of stars at night. Now, the third argument is that you don't see a blast crater from the lunar lander. And they'd say, well, if this is real and not fake, you would have seen a big blast crater. Well, there's a couple problems here. And this is really not a strong argument. It's a misunderstanding of how the thrust on the thruster worked, especially the thrust on that thruster in a vacuum. Now, the lunar lander had a thrust of approximately 3,000 pounds as it approached the moon. Now, that's a lot of thrust. And if that thrust was coming out of a nozzle the size of a garden hose, that would have spread dust all over the place. But the nozzle is 54 inches across. That's about 2,300 square inches. And when you work the math on this, which I didn't, but I trust the folks that did, you're dealing with about 1.5 pounds of thrust per square inch. Now, that's not a lot of thrust per square inch, but the whole package was enough to land the lunar lander. Now, in a vacuum, and the moon is in a vacuum, folks, rocket exhaust is going to spread out much faster than it will in an atmosphere. And because it spreads out faster, it reduces the pressure. The pressure doesn't build up in a pile where it slams in the ground. It's spreading out more. And when the nozzle diameter is small, the thrust is accelerated locally. But when the nozzle diameter is larger, the thrust is spread out. So the fact of the matter is, with 1.5 pounds of nozzle pressure per square inch, there would only be a little bit of dust being spread. You're not going to, this would be like if you put talcum powder on your desk and blew with 1.5 pounds of pressure, you would move a little talcum powder. You would not move a lot of talcum powder. So that's really how the argument works for the lunar thrust. Now, another one is that And I just put the third and the fourth arguments together, but that's just the way it goes. The shadows that some people say for the fifth argument, they're not black in the pictures. You see shadows that are lighter colored. And the claim is that if direct sunlight is the only source of sunlight or the only source of light on the moon, and the atmosphere isn't scattering the light, then the shadows should be black. But the problem is here, they're not taking into consideration the reflection of the light off the surface of the moon or off the astronauts' bright spacesuits or off the spacecraft itself. This is really a lack of understanding of how reflection works. The lunar dust reflects light. Now, it only reflects 8%, but that's quite a bit. That's actually quite a bit of reflection. That's bright. So if it reflects 8% of the light that comes and it shines it back the direction it came from, then it's going to diminish the blackness of the shadow. Now, further, this light that's reflected is also going to hit the lander, and that's going to light up shadows on the lander that you would think would be darker than they are. But that's because the sunlight's shining past the lander, hitting the ground, and then bouncing back towards the lander. This effect is called Heiligenschein in German in the scientific world. It's the English word, we typically call it a halo. But we see a similar thing on wet grass on a cool morning. When the sun shines, light reflects back off of that. And I've seen this happen on sidewalks too, where there's a glare of water on the sidewalk and the sun hits it just right. And all of a sudden I'm momentarily blinded. The light is bouncing off that little layer of water. There's different things that will cause this Heiligenschein or this light reflection. And so as soon as you accept the light reflection, reducing the darkness of the shadows, there's no more problem with those shadows being gray instead of black. I've seen similar things myself on numerous instances in my life where light reflecting off of water or light reflecting off of a white building itself reduces the darkness of a shadow. Now, another argument that's made is that the shadows are not parallel. So they show pictures where the shadow of a man and the shadow of the flagpole, or the shadow of a man and the shadow of the lander, etc., are not parallel. They're at different angles. Typically, they're kind of angled towards each other. But this isn't a strong argument either. Basically, what's going on here is the argument is saying there must be two light sources, because if there's only one light source, then those shadows should be parallel. But this really is misunderstanding a couple different things. First of all, if there actually were two sources of light, and they set them up like they do on stage, one side on one side, one light on the side and one on the other side, those shadows would not be almost parallel but kind of tipping towards each other, or almost parallel but tipping a little bit away from each other. The shadows would be crossing. In my studio, when I make shadows from my lights, the shadows are crossing. And the more lights I have, the more odd the shadows get. When you have two shadows that are nearly parallel, but they look like they're tipping towards each other or tipping a little bit away from each other, there's two things that cause this. One is simply the distortion of perspective. When you're taking pictures of two things that are not the exact same distance from an angle from you. And if The more they're apart to the side of you, the more those angles are going to appear to tip. The more uneven the ground is. Let's see here, like ground being uneven, the more those shadows are going to tip. If the ground's tipping towards you, then that shadow's going to tip in. If the ground is tipping away, then the shadow's going to tip away. So the topography and the perspective are going to vary. So you can do this experiment yourself at home. Go outside when the sun is low and pick two objects that are not directly in front of you. One's off to your side a little bit, and the other's off to the other side a little bit, and they're a little bit different differences away. And the sun's behind you, and look at where the shadows go. They're going to appear to tip towards each other unless the ground is leaning heavily one way, and then they will appear to tip maybe even away from each other a little bit. This is just a matter of perspective. And again, anyone that's done a lot of camera work is going to be fully aware of this concept of perspective. If they've worked with studio lights, they're going to know what's going on. All right, here's another argument. The claim is often made that the people that work the studio stages made mistakes, and they used the same mountain for two different sets, and they screwed up. And they have one time they used the mountain with the picture of the lander, and one time they had the mountain and the lander wasn't there. But folks, again, there's no real evidence here. This is simply a matter of distance and perspective, or what we would call parallax. In the first picture, the lander is maybe 20 or 30 meters from the astronaut. In the next picture, the astronaut has moved a couple hundred meters to the side. Now, the same mountain's in the background, but the mountain's a couple kilometers away. So when you're taking a picture where you're taking a picture of the mountain and you've got the lunar lander in the picture, and then you move a few hundred yards to the side, you take a picture of the mountain, you're not going to see the lunar lander, but the mountain, because it's a few kilometers away, isn't going to look very different at all. That's all this is. So so far, all these points, there's just a simple explanation that's understood by people that do photography, or that's understood by people that do lighting. They understand these points, and they can process through and say, oh yeah, I understand. Okay, that explains how that arose. And they completely erase the supposed problems. Now, another common one is that the astronauts, if they shifted in the cabin, it would throw off the center of mass. And that would throw the lunar lander off balance, and it would crash the lander. And therefore, the landing is fake. Well, folks, there really isn't an argument here. The lunar lander had a feedback control system on it. And that feedback control system determined if the axis was shifting or if the center of gravity was being off. And it could adjust the nozzle to direct, to make small changes so that it could balance out the change in the center of gravity. And that was for the descent. On the ascent, when they took off, they didn't use angle on the nozzle anymore. They had a series of small rockets they could use, and those little rockets, they just fire on one side or the other to make small adjustments. So there really isn't a problem here on this center of gravity issue, or this with this lander getting off balance. They had a system to keep things in balance. It was computer checked and balanced. But here's another interesting issue. Now, they're claiming there's a problem only for the lunar lander. But all rockets have to have a method to shift the center of gravity as the fuel burns, because as the fuel burns in a rocket, the center of gravity is going to change. So they have to have a method in that rocket long before the lander stage to adjust the center of gravity, because otherwise that rocket will start tumbling and rolling in orbit and it'll be a disaster. So there is no issue with the center of gravity. That's not an issue at all. Now, another argument they claim, this is number 9, there's no flame from the rocket when the top half of the lunar lander took off and left the base on the moon, and it took off to go reconnect with the Apollo spaceship. Well, this got an easy answer, folks. The fuel they used didn't have a visible flame. They used a mix of hydrazine and dinitrogen tetraoxide. And now men were expecting to see a flame, because when you see the Apollo rockets launch, or the Saturn rockets, the big Saturn V's, there was massive visible flames. And they expected to see flames on the lunar lander. But they used a different fuel. And they didn't have visible flames. Number 10, when you double the speed of the movies of the astronauts driving the lunar lander, or the lunar rover, they looked like they were filmed on Earth and slowed down, so they were clearly faked. Well, certain aspects of those video clips probably could be faked, but there's some things in those videos that are impossible to fake. For instance, when you watch the clips, you're going to see dust thrown up by the wheels, moon dust. And that moon dust flows in a perfect parabolic arc, and it drops back down to the surface. You could not do this if you filmed this on Earth. That would be impossible. If it had been filmed on Earth with Earth's atmosphere, the dust would have made clouds above the wheels and around the wheels, and would have made clouds of dust that drifted along the surface. There are no clouds in these pictures, folks. No dust clouds. The dust just goes up and drops right back down. This proves that that video was shot in a zero gravity, zero atmosphere situation, or a near zero gravity, because it's 1/7 of the gravity of Earth. You could not fake this in a studio, folks. They did not have the ability to fake that. We didn't have the ability then. I don't think we have it now to shoot a video where you fake moon's gravity and no atmosphere with dust. Now, we can fake it with humans. They're pretty good with those wires and making them look like they're bouncing around in zero gravity situations. And they've gotten very good at that, no doubt about it. But you cannot fake that dust that rolls up in the air in a parabolic arc and goes back down and does not make a dust cloud. It's impossible to fake that. NASA would have had to build an absolutely massive studio, remove all of the air, and they would have had to remove the gravity down to 1/7 of the gravity of Earth. And they didn't have the ability to do that then, and they don't have the ability to do it now. So, number 11, all the pictures from the moon are nearly perfectly centered. And yet the cameras were mounted on the spacesuits and didn't have a finder window. So the finder window is what you look into to make sure your picture's lined up. So there's no way that they could have taken perfect pictures every time. So this proves they had to have faked it. No, it doesn't. They took thousands of pictures, folks. And most of the pictures were bad to mediocre. But there was lots of good pictures. Just a matter of probability. And they raised the probability because they practiced with those cameras thousands and thousands of shots here on Earth before they went to the moon. and they got pretty good at judging the trajectory of the camera and where that picture was going to go. They didn't get perfect at it, but they got pretty good. So all you have to do is understand on this one that they took thousands of pictures and hundreds of them were good. Another argument that people often bring up is the cameras had crosshairs etched on them to help measure objects in the pictures. But in some of the pictures, it looks like there's objects that are in front of the crosshairs. This isn't possible if the crosshairs were in the cameras. So this implies that the crosshairs were added to the images, and it's proof that the photos were faked. Well, that doesn't prove this at all, folks. This is simply a matter of overexposure. That's all it is. The crosshairs looked blacked out or blocked out because the object that they were photographing is white or very bright, and the image got overexposed. And when you do this, the white will bleed around the other things in the picture. If you have an overexposed picture, you get bright spots that show up in the picture and it covers stuff. And it looks like it's in front of everything, but it's not really in front of everything. It's just overexposure. So this little crosshatch that should have been showing up in the photos gets partially or entirely covered up by overexposure. I'm not a huge photographer now, but I took enough pictures as a kid, and I took enough pictures when I was in the Ranger Battalion, and I had my old Canon A1 camera that I would occasionally have an overexposed picture, and it would do that exact same thing. Now, here's one that gets brought up a lot. The radiation from the Van Allen belts would have killed the astronauts in minutes. In fact, I read one guy said that you would have had to have 4 to 6 feet of lead on the spaceship just to safely traverse the Van Allen belts. And this is often bolstered with an interview from a former Russian cosmonaut who claimed that the Russians were worried about the radiation. Well, the Russians were worried about the radiation, and so were the Americans. But this is really a weak argument. It really misunderstands the Van Allen radiation belt. When I read these people making these kind of arguments, they seem to be thinking of radiation like nuclear fallout. And if you were going to have radiation like a nuclear explosion and the fallout from that or the immediate nuclear blast radiation, yeah, then you would need a lot of feet of lead to blast through that and to be in that radiation for an hour. You need a lot of lead, a lot of something. But you can't think of the Van Allen radiation belts like it's a nuclear explosion. The radiation in the Van Allen radiation belt is the same radiation folks, that we face down here on Earth when we're out playing in the sun. That's all it is. It's just that that belt blocks and catches most of the radiation that would otherwise come down to Earth. So it's the same radiation that causes sunburn in the short run and skin cancer over many years of exposure. And yes, unprotected men would get a lethal dose of radiation if they stayed in the belt long enough, unprotected. And they could even get a lethal dose if they stayed in the radiation belt long enough protected. Nobody's denying that. But the fact of the matter is, the ship passed through the radiation belt in about an hour. And the astronauts were protected by the ship and by a thin radiation protection in the ship. Now, the radiation was tested by NASA. Every time they sent astronauts up, they sent them up with personal dosimeters attached to their spacesuits. And they discovered that when people passed out through the Van Allen radiation belt and then passed back through the Van Allen radiation belt, they received about approximately the same amount of radiation as you would get from 2 chest x-rays, which is 1 to 2 rems. What's also interesting about this is James Van Allen, who's the scientist after whom the Van Allen radiation belts are named, dismissed this argument for the moon landing hoax as just a bunch of nonsense. He's the guy that the belt is named after him, and he's one of the original researchers in the radiation in the Van Allen belt. And he regarded this argument as to why we couldn't have gone to the moon as utter nonsense. So I want you to think of this illustration for how you traverse the Van Allen radiation belt. The illustration is firewalking. You take a small bed of coals, and if you walk across those coals fast enough, like really quick steps, the thermal conductivity of your feet is low enough that if you move your feet fast, you're not going to get any kind of a significant or serious burn. You might get a little bit of redness like you got a sunburn, but you're not going to actually burn your feet because you barely touch it just long enough, and then you raise your feet, and then your foot's cooling off, and then it goes down again. This is the thermal conductivity of your feet will protect you. The same thing, if you pass through the Van Allen radiation belt fast enough, you're not going to get the radiation burn. If you stayed in it without protection, you would get sunburned insanely fast and you would get burnt to a crisp. All right. Argument number 14 here is the Apollo the Apollo 1 fire that killed Roger Chaffee, Ed White, and Gus Grissom. It's claimed that wasn't an accident. It's claimed that NASA killed Grissom because he was going to blow the whistle to the press. I don't even know what to say about this one, folks. I find this to be a very disgusting accusation. And it hardly needs a reply. I think men are going to stand before God and give account for propagating this. They don't have any proof. This is all assertion. There's zero proof for that. Here's another one. Argument number 15. The footprint in one of the moon photos doesn't match Neil Armstrong's preserved boot. So, first of all, in the footprint that's usually shown, the photograph of the footprint that's usually shown, the footprint is Buzz Aldrin's footprint, not Neil Armstrong's footprint. So they're already wrong. And secondly, the footprints that were made on the moon were made while they were wearing their lunar overshoes, which makes the foot a lot bigger than just a simple moon boot. And they left the overshoes on the moon. They left the lunar rover on the moon. They left a bunch of stuff on the moon. They didn't take it back. There was a weight issue. They're going to take back some moon rocks. They had to leave a lot of stuff. So the size of the footprint isn't an argument at all. Here's another one. It's often claimed that NASA did not have the technology to go to the moon. But under the pressure of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, they were forced to fake it. I think this is the exact opposite of the truth. We didn't have the technology to fake the moon landing. We might have the technology to fake it now, at least most aspects of it. We'd still have a very difficult time faking that parabolic arc of the dust with no dust clouds that was when the dust was thrown up by the lunar rover. We couldn't fake that, but most of the stuff we could fake. But back in the 1969, folks, the science fiction movies, the moon scenes and the Mars scenes and the outer space scenes were really cheesy. They did not have the technology to fake the moon landing. Now, I'm going to cover this a little bit more in the next section. So I'm just going to leave this one right here. Um, we didn't have the technology to fake the moon landing, but we barely did have the technology to go to the moon. Now, someone will raise the question, another question is, if we went to the moon in 1969, why haven't we gone back? Well, we have different priorities in our geopolitical efforts. We turned from the moon to the space shuttle program, and then we turned to the International Space Station. But another point that needs to be taken up is that once President Kennedy's grand challenge was accomplished, where we got to the moon, and we went there 6 times we had men walking on the moon, there's no longer any incentive to keep this going. Unless they were dead serious about the moon base and then making a base from there to go to Mars. But I think there was a realization that they didn't have the technology to safely go beyond a moon landing and to put a permanent base on the moon and then to jump from there to Mars. It was just beyond us. And it was decades beyond us to do that. So that's why we're only thinking about it now. And the program too was prohibitively expensive. It was something like, I can't remember the cost, was like $350 million back then, just for one Saturn V rocket that you shot at once and it was done. That was a lot of money. Two more arguments here that we'll go through. Number 18, space suits can't operate air conditioning in a vacuum. There's no argument here, folks. This is just bad physics. Heat is radiation. Whether you're adding heat or removing heat, you're just moving radiation. That's all you're doing. Radiation can travel all day long in a vacuum. It does it every day. All the heat that we get from the sun is radiation traveling in a vacuum. And the fact is, the astronauts removed heat from their suits. They had water tubes in their suits that then flowed to a cooling unit on the back of their suit. That's that little square thing on the back of their suit. And the back of their suit then transferred the excess heat via radiation out into the empty space. So the last point, why can't the Hubble telescope see anything on the moon? The Hubble telescope is so powerful, we can take pictures of galaxies that are millions of miles away. How come we can't take pictures of the moon? Well, we can take pictures of the moon if we wanted to. But the problem is the Hubble telescope, its resolution is only 280 feet. In other words, 86 meters. So anything that's smaller than that, it doesn't really pick it up well. It only picks up large objects. So it's great for shooting pictures of big planets. It's great distant stars or whatever, galaxies. But it wouldn't take pictures on the moon that would see the lunar lander. The lunar lander is 9 meters across, or about 28 feet or so, 29 feet. It just wouldn't pick it up. All right, now I got a few arguments here. I want to give you 9 arguments which are defenses of the moon landing. Let's take up the technology question. The technology to fake the moon landing credibly, so it didn't look cheesy, simply did not exist in 1969. Now, we had the technology, we barely had the technology to go to the moon and back, but we didn't have the technology to fake the moon landing. Until the last decade or two, we're able to fake most of it. There's still things about the moon landing that we cannot fake because we do not have the ability to make a complete vacuum that's the size of a studio set, and that also bring that to 1/7 of the gravity of the Earth. We don't have the ability to do that. Um, so the conspiracy theory that Stanley Kubrick or some other big Hollywood hotshot filmed the whole thing in a movie studio is just an outlandish claim. It's We did not have the technology to do that. Um, what's interesting about this, I'm going to take that up in a second. I'm going to keep going. Um, our TV technology back then and our video camera technology, it was really primitive. When you look at the movies from the 60s and 70s, they were cheesy. All the science fiction movies, they were really cheesy. We didn't even make a big step in the right direction until Star Wars. And the original Star Wars movie compared to what they're doing now was pretty cheesy itself. All right. When you look at, for instance, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey movie, and you watch that, it had unrealistic scenes of the moon. How did he fake the moon landing? Well, he didn't. Okay, so let's compare the moon landing in a real comparison, a real world comparison. The US going to the moon with primitive space technology in 1969 is very easily and readily compared to Magellan's attempt to circumnavigate the globe in 1519 to 1522 with the technology of his day. Folks, back then, they didn't have any way to desalinate the water that was in the ocean. No, they couldn't do that. And so they were dependent on fresh water that fell as rain, or they were dependent on fresh water gathered from land. That was it. But worse, to circumnavigate the globe, they had a mediocre way to gauge latitude. It was just mediocre. And they had an absolutely miserable way, or several miserable ways, to gauge longitude. So between a mediocre way to gauge your latitude and a miserable way to gauge your longitude, you really couldn't know, once you're a few days away from land, where you were at. You couldn't know for sure where you were at. You were largely guessing. And so the effort in 1519 to circumnavigate the globe, when they barely had the technology to do it, was bold and daring and audacious. And some of them died. That's exactly the situation we were in when we went to the moon in 1969. It was bold, it was daring, it was audacious. And looking back, we barely had the technology to do it, and it was risky. But we did it. And if it was impossible for man to go to the moon in 1969, then it was impossible for Magellan to sail around the world in 1519. They are morally the same. Now, here's another interesting one. I find it fascinating that many of the people who claim that the moon landing is a hoax, these same people believe that the US now has the technology to create and steer hurricanes. Now, you tell me, how are these two ideas able to be reconciled? How did we make the jump from inability to go to the moon in 1969 to 2020 being able to create a hurricane and steer it? We're only talking 50 years here, folks. Now, the fact of the matter is, it takes several magnitudes of advance in technology to create a hurricane and steer it. To be honest, I absolutely do not believe that we have the ability to create hurricanes or steer them. I think this is one of the most silly conspiracy theories that believers believe and teach. It takes more energy, folks, to create a hurricane than all the energy that we make in a whole day in the entire world. All the hydroelectric, all the solar, all the gas, all the coal, all the diesel, all the nuclear generators, everything put together, all that energy may not be enough to actually create a hurricane. And then you have to focus. Where is this gigantic satellite that you're going to use to focus the energy to create a hurricane? And where are you going to get all that energy beamed up to the satellite to focus it? So where are these secret energy bases? At any rate, it's completely contradictory to believe that we have the technology to create and steer hurricanes today. And 50 years ago, we did not have the technology to go to the moon. They're completely contradictory. One of them is false. And I think it's the hurricane one. All right. Here's, and I mentioned this one already. Studios to this day cannot create a low gravity vacuum atmosphere. We just can't do it. We have a hard enough time making small vacuums for experiments, small room size vacuums. To make a studio size vacuum is a huge problem. And then to bring that to low gravity, no, we don't have the ability, folks. We can simulate many things of low gravity, but we can't simulate dust in low gravity. We haven't figured that out yet. Maybe we will someday, but right now we don't have it. Here's another argument, number 3, that's defending the moon landing. And this is powerful. How come the Soviets never debunked the moon landings? How is this even possible if the moon landing is a hoax? The main reason for America going to the moon was to beat the Soviets in the space race. This was like war practically. And they had every incentive to hunt for evidence of failure or exploitation or hoax. And they didn't find any. If they had found evidence that the moon landing was a hoax, they would have embarrassed America, royally embarrassed America. They would have leaked it. They would have put it in the papers. It would have been well known. The fact of the matter is, the Soviet Union and many of the European nations that were allied with her or allied with us had advanced missile and rocket tracking capabilities. They were designed to track ICBMs, which leave the Earth's atmosphere and then come back. And the Russians tracked the flight of the Apollo vehicles, all the way to the moon and back. They tracked it all 9 flights. They tracked all 6 flights where we went to the moon and walked on the moon. They knew we went to the moon. They could not deny that we went to the moon. And we embarrassed them royally. If they had the evidence that we faked it, they would have debunked our claims. They had every incentive to debunk those claims. This was war, folks. It was a Cold War. They didn't have the facts to prove. Not only did they not have the facts to prove that we didn't go to the moon, they had the facts that proved that we did go to the moon. And the Soviets begrudgingly admitted that Americans landed on the moon. Now, here, this is compounded. This is the fourth point. We traveled to the moon 9 times and we landed on it 6 times. Now, it would have been difficult enough to fake going to the moon once. How do you fake it over and over and over again and not get caught? How did the Russians or our allies not catch the hoax? When you think about the variables that are involved here, this the claim that the moon landing is a hoax, it gets more and more ludicrous. The Russians tracked us. European nations tracked the Apollo vehicles going all the way to the moon and coming back. They tracked them all the way there and all the way back, over and over and over again. Undeniable evidence. Now, nobody, not one nation on Earth, not one astronomical organization on Earth, nobody reported that the Apollo craft never left the Earth's atmosphere and just orbited around the Earth over and over again. Nobody reported it. How did they miss this? If the Apollo craft had never left Earth orbit and just was orbiting up there in the outer atmospheres, just outside the Earth or just in near Earth orbit or wherever they were at, they would have been visible to the naked eye like satellites are today. But it would have been the brightest satellite in the history that we have. It would have been brighter than the space station. And probably only Moon and Venus would have been brighter objects in the sky. And they were moving really fast. They would be crossing the sky in very short order. So people noticing bright objects moving across the sky would have been reported. Nobody reported. No astronomy organizations, no universities, no backyard telescope people reported that they had proof that the Apollo vehicles didn't leave Earth and that they were actually just orbiting Earth in satellite orbit. Nobody reported this. None of the Earth's radar systems picked up the hoax. None of the missile tracking systems picked up the hoax. None of the observatories on Earth picked up this hoax. No backyard telescope enthusiasts picked up on the hoax. Nobody tracking the satellites with their naked eye picked up on the hoax. Why did nobody pick up on this hoax? Because it wasn't a hoax. We actually went to the moon. Here's another argument for the fact that we went to the moon. We left laser reflectors on the moon. And to this day, 50 years later, scientific organizations around the Earth like NASA and the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency and Roscosmos and other organizations, they fire lasers at these reflectors and they can make accurate measurements of the distance from the Earth to the moon. Another argument that it's in favor that we went to the moon is we have recent photographs of the landing sites. In 2009, for instance, we launched the LRO, which is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It's designed to map the lunar surface with 3 or 4 orders of magnitude greater resolution than any prior effort. And up to this point, they've mapped about 98% of the moon with 100-meter resolution. And they've mapped the Apollo landing sites with half-meter resolution. Now, what's interesting about this is that in these lunar landing sites, you can still see the lunar vehicles, you can see the lunar rovers, and you can see the tracks of the lunar rovers. So there's new evidence, and this evidence continually comes up. Here's another argument. I got 2 more. There are still people alive today, and in the decades past, there was a lot more alive, who either went to the moon or participated at some other high level in this project. And all of them have stuck to their guns the whole time that we went to the moon. And nobody has stepped forwards and blown the whistle. Now, this is interesting because we have many whistleblowers on the cover-ups that involve Area 51, Roswell, the UFOs, alien tech, alien biologics, reverse engineered alien tech. We got all kinds of cover-up whistleblowers here. Not always as high up the food chain as we would like, but we have some. Why are there no high up whistleblowers on the moon landing? Why don't astronauts or engineers that were way high up there step up and say, I'm on my deathbed, it's time for me to confess. It was all fake. We faked it just to beat the Russians. We don't have this. If this was a hoax, folks, we would have it. Wherever there's a cover-up, it eventually gets broken. Area 51, Roswell, UFOs, alien tech, blah, 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 alien biologics, reverse engineered alien tech. We have people stepping forwards. The moon landing, we don't have people stepping forwards. It's not a cover-up. The last point is we have moon rocks in our possession, which feature minerals and characteristics not known on Earth. There are isotopes in the moon rocks that aren't found on Earth. And it would be more difficult to actually manufacture these rocks with these isotopes in them than it would be to travel to the moon and pick them up. And thousands of published papers on these moon rocks by scientists in dozens of countries have been published on these moon rocks. These scientists have examined them, and they all agree on what's in them and where they came from. And many of these people, they have no plausible reason to cooperate with the hoax. They were independent scientists, and they got loaned the moon rocks, and they examined them. And they all agreed these are isotopes that are not found here on Earth. Now, if any of these geologists had published a paper that was skeptical that these were moon rocks and said, actually, these isotopes, they're actually found on Earth. You can find them in Siberia or Antarctica or the Sahara Desert. They would have said so. Not one of them has ever produced evidence that these were not lunar rocks. So we looked at 19 arguments why the lunar landing is a hoax. That none of them were massive arguments that, if they were true, would have proven it was a hoax, but they were all interesting. But every one of these not so massive arguments has a reasonable explanation. So they're not really impediments to a moon landing. They're not even difficulties. If a supposed difficulty has a readily explained explanation, based on understanding how cameras work, or based on exposure, or based on actual historical facts, if they all have readily available explanations, then none of the arguments are worth anything. And if none of the arguments are worth anything, then it's time to drop the lunar hoax theory, the lunar landing hoax theory, and just embrace the lunar landing as a fact. Now, let me say this in conclusion. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been a help in learning to examine all the evidence and weighing all the evidence. In matters like this, matters of history, the belief in the actual historicity of the moon landing prevails. That's just the starting point. It's true until proven false. And it prevails until men produce actual evidence that disproves the lunar landing. Now, most of the arguments that were made against the proof of the lunar landing were not actually the kind of arguments that would disprove the lunar landing. They were just difficulties that people had a hard time understanding. So until there's real proof that we didn't go to the moon, then we have a moral obligation to believe that we went to the moon. It's just an accepted historical fact, and it's true until proven false. Now, if you want to prove that we didn't go to the moon, this is what you have to do. There's a few things you can do, and the more of them you do, the better. First of all, you need to find the sealed documents of White House meetings, of NASA meetings, of collaboration meetings with big shots in Hollywood, and trot out actual historical evidence that the moon landing was a planned hoax. If you can bring that out, you've got some serious evidence. Now, I don't think you're going to bring that out. The odds are pretty high that if that evidence was out there, some of it would have already leaked. And rumors that it's out there, folks, that's not evidence. That somebody's cousin's brother heard something once from a general doesn't mean anything. Now, the second thing is show evidence from Russian documentation or Chinese documentation or some of their allies that they had evidence that we faked the moon landing. You can bring that out. Okay, now you've got some solid evidence. And if the moon landing is fake, that evidence is out there. If that evidence is not out there, then the moon landing is not fake. And here's even a better one. Show evidence from the Russians or the Europeans or any other major nation on earth, the Chinese. Show any evidence from anybody that was tracking the Apollo flights. Find the evidence that they tracked the flights and that the flights didn't leave Earth's gravitational field and they stayed in Earth orbit. If the moon landings are a hoax, folks, that evidence is out there. Go find it. If you can't find that evidence, folks, and you find the evidence that yes, they tracked us and we did go to the moon, then you have to drop the lunar landing hoax theory. Finally, bring out the testimonies. There should be thousands of them. Go find them. The testimonies of folks, backyard astronomers and regular astronomers, anybody that saw the brightest satellite in history that lasted for maybe 8 days and then disappeared. Super bright, super fast. Go find these testimonies. If the lunar landing is a hoax, there's hundreds or thousands of these testimonies out there. Now, if you can't find these testimonies, then the lunar landing is not a hoax. So this is the kind of information you have to find. This information would prove that the lunar landing is a hoax. Nobody's ever really attempted to bring out this kind of information. They just find petty little difficulties in pictures and then claim there's problems. I hardly know what to say. All these little petty difficulties that they find, they all have explanations. Common sense, everyday science explanations. Most of them are things that you could do yourself. It's observable, testable, repeatable science. Many of them you can do in your backyard with your own camera or with your own observations. So the bottom line is, folks, anybody who's willing to spend a few honest hours, maybe one whole day on Google, reading both sides of this issue and not just reading the rabbit hole side, is going to find reasonable explanations for every difficulty raised by the moon landing deniers. And you're going to find that these reasonable explanations absolutely end the denial, because you've got all these petty little problems, but you don't have any real rock solid evidence. And If you had the rock solid evidence, you wouldn't need the petty problems. You've got the petty problems and they all have nice answers. So this should end the theory that the moon landing was a hoax, and should end the moon landing denial. But why doesn't the evidence that's out there end this? Well, folks, this is why I am pushing methodology so hard on stuff like this that doesn't have anything directly to do with Bible doctrine. Because these doubts are not based on scientific method. They're not based on science. They're based on rabid doubt that's just running through society like a plague. We're doubting traditional understanding. We're just going to doubt all American history. We're just going to doubt everything that men believed. We're going to doubt all the evangelical fundamental doctrines. We're going to doubt the pre-trib rapture. We're going to doubt everything, because now doubt is the greatest sign of spirituality. And I just completely repudiate the spirit, folks. I want nothing to do with it. I want to be evidence-based. I want to be science-based. And I just don't go down rabbit holes unless there's no other options. And so far, I always find options. If you want more evidence on this, folks, you can start by going to badastronomy.com, just like it's spelled, badastronomy.com. Or you can go to clavius.org, clavius.org. Now, on clavius.org, about half the links are dead. I'll just warn you ahead of time. The site was made, I don't know, 2002 or 2003. Hasn't been updated in a long time, but about half the links are still valid. So at any rate, folks, we need to be men and women that follow the facts and follow the evidence. And we want to be people that avoid rabbit holes. We want to be evidence-based. We don't want to be chasing a small handful of evidence down a rabbit hole. We want to weigh all the evidence. And so that's why I do these messages. Because if you will use bad methodology and ignore most of the evidence on an issue like the flat earth or the moon landing hoax, if you'll do that there, you are going to do it in your doctrine too. It's just guaranteed. You can't avoid it. This spreads like gangrene. Once you allow bad methodology into your life, you will get hooked on it. You will get addicted to it. And it will spread until it infects everything you touch. And you don't want to be there. Your methodology is your number one goal as a believer. If you're on Bible stuff, you want every verse in the Bible on the subject. And you're not going to rest until you have an answer that resolves every passage in the Bible on the subject. You won't say amen to a theory that takes 1/3 of the Bible and says amen to it, and 2/3 of the Bible evidence and says no. Same methodology for the flat earth, for the moon landing, for everything else. You weigh all the evidence, and then you come to a conclusion that says amen to all of the evidence. So if you get your methodology right, folks, it's going to serve you in science. It's going to serve you on Bible issues, doctrinal issues. It'll serve you on how to understand passages. It'll serve you on these secondary issues like the moon landing or Satan's little season or any of these other unbiblical issues that are roiling the church today or King James only. You get your methodology right, and it will serve you in all those areas. Well, with that, I'm going to wind up. I've talked for nearly an hour and 40 minutes, and we can move on to the Q&A. All righty. Okay. And questions. Here we go. Okay. We know pagan gods are fallen spiritual beings from 1 Corinthians 10, 20, and 21, and also that scripture never mentions female angels. So, where did the pagans get goddesses? Well, I'm not certain that the Bible never mentions female angels. There are the two female winged beings that carried the vessel of iniquity in Zechariah over to Babylon. So there are hints like that, that there might be female angels. The other thing that might be a consideration is that when the angels came down and dealt with the human beings, they may have taken on forms that were unnatural to them. If they were able to cohabit with human beings, they were obviously probably changed at least a little bit. We do read, I can't remember if it's in Peter or in Jude, that they left their first or natural estate as an angel, and then they were guilty of sexual sin that's comparable to homosexuality. That's having sex outside your kind. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were perverted beyond the others and they took on female forms while the many stayed male. I'm not really sure all the details of that, but that's the kind of things I can conceive of. Does my new house in Oklahoma have a library like I have now and a studio like I have now? No, neither one are in the new house. So we will have to put our books. I'm dismantling my bookshelves and I will put them up in the new house. And we will have to build a studio there. So we're going to try and replicate as close as we can the Sooth Keep studio. If the moon landing really happened and technology has increased, why have they not returned? Well, we've got a couple issues going on here. One, um, the Saturn rocket program was extremely expensive, cost prohibitive. I wouldn't be surprised if those rockets would cost north of $1 billion or more now, maybe $2 billion a piece. With modern prices compared to back then, they were $350 million a piece back then. Um, and the 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 blueprints for building those rockets, we'd be starting from scratch. Somehow the blueprints were lost. Nobody really knows where they went. Uh, and so we'd be starting from scratch. So I think really where the US is going, NASA has focused on trying to let private sector come up with more cost-effective methods of space travel. And you've got folks like Elon Musk working on that now with the vision for the moon and with the vision for Mars. We're going to be looking at rockets being much smaller and much cheaper. If the Lord tarries, I do believe that mankind would not only return to the moon, but would do so in a relatively safe way. We would go there to build a lunar base that would be safer than our original moon landing situations. And then we would go from there. We'd probably develop lunar mining, orbital bases out there, and then go from there to Mars. So they're going to return. It's just a matter of time. And the only consideration that really stands in the way is the Lord going to allow that, or is he going to prohibit it because he's going to return before that's ever happens? I wouldn't be surprised if the Lord returns, a rapture happens and the tribulation starts before man returns to the moon or before man goes to Mars. Okay, how does the burning and dissolving of earth in 2 Peter 3:10 happen at the second coming? And how are the saints who survived the tribulation going to survive the burning up of the whole earth? Well, that's a good question. But we do read in Psalms that when the fire's falling from heaven, that 1,000 will fall at the right and 10,000 at the left. Maybe I got that reversed. The Lord will preserve the believers when this fire is falling. And he's also going to preserve some for the sheep and goats judgment, who are going to be goats. Uh, but the earth will be burned up. All of all the trees and grass is going to be burned up. The ocean's going to be uh, destroyed. All of man's structures and glory are going to be destroyed. Somehow, there'll be some human beings left. If Elon Musk is so into rockets going into space and the moon is so accessible, why isn't he gone there? Well, one of the things that we're dealing with the modern rocket program is we're trying to do things in a way that's much more efficient than was done with the Saturn V rocket program in the 60s. Those were absolutely massive, enormous rockets. Took a massive amount of fuel to leave Earth, and then that whole back section would just drop off and fall into the ocean, burning up uh, on the way. So we're trying to develop technology right now that's going to be much smaller, much more efficient, much more cost effective. Really, the issue back then was simply, let's throw a bunch of money at this and let's beat the Russians. They were treating it like it was Rocky versus that Russian dude in the Rocky movies. Let's just get up there as fast as we can and beat him. So what we're looking at now, we don't really have a race to the moon. We don't really have a race to Mars. They're looking at this more like a business proposition. And there is some competition here, but not like there was back in the 60s in the Cold War. Uh, they they're looking at this like once they get into this, they're here to stay. I mean, Elon Musk is building a satellite system so that there's going to be satellite phone and internet around the globe. He started that. He's going to stick with it. He's going to finish it. He's working on the technology towards heading for Mars. I think he's dead serious about it. I don't think the Lord's going to allow him to get there, but they're definitely going in that direction. And they are going to slowly and efficiently develop technology that actually works. What some of the stuff they're working on right now for lunar missions is small, portable nuclear power plants, and they're working on how to get little housing systems on the moon, so that this stuff is going to go there first and be ready for man when he shows up, and then they just have to set these structures up. Uh, they're working on machines that will make oxygen there on the moon. That's one of the big things that we have to hurdles that we have to face, how to get water and oxygen on the moon. It's not efficient to just bottle up big canisters of oxygen and water and ship it to the moon. You need to be able to make water and oxygen efficiently on the moon. So that's some of the reasons why we're not there yet, because we're not going there for a race. We're going there for permanent habitation, for mining, for business. So it's a very different dynamic. It's not Cold War America versus Russia. It's a business dynamic. Did I decide to talk about this topic because you had a discussion with someone over it? Uh, no, not really. This topic has been on my mind. It's been on my list to do for months. I've actually had dozens of conversations on this in the last 6 months with dozens of people. Some of them calling me basically retarded and morally corrupt and perverted because I don't believe that the lunar landing was a hoax, and every smart person on the earth believes it was a hoax. Some of them being a little bit more considerate, but I run into this continually on Twitter. I run into it on YouTube constantly. I run into it on Facebook constantly. I've seen it on Telegram and other places, Instagram. So it's all over the place. There's no particular individual, it's dozens of individuals. Um, and it was simply a matter of time getting this, dealing with the new wine stuff at the same time, dealing with my Zechariah stuff that I had to finish. This just happened to be where it fits in. This is off topic, but were the Old Testament prophets always from the Levite tribe? I never heard that before, and I don't think it's true. Do I plan on doing YouTube lives on debunking preterism and amillennialism in the near future? Yeah, probably. Those are areas that absolutely have to be addressed. In fact, I've been thinking of on my to-do list. It's one of the things that's been there for about a year. I'd like to have Michael Vlock on my program and have him address premillennialism versus amillennialism, since he is one of the world experts, in my estimation, on the subject. Am I done with my book on the pre-wrath rapture? Answered, no, I'm about halfway done. I had originally set the summer aside just for writing that book, and I'd hoped to get it done by the fall conference. And then uh, several things came up that I could not ignore. And then the move came up. And so basically, my whole summer is getting absorbed with getting ready to move and moving. And then when we get where we're going, setting up the library, setting up the studio. And then October comes and the conference cycle starts again till next spring. So I do definitely have plans to finish that pre-wrath rapture book. I try and work on it almost every day. I'm also working on my primary thing right now is updating the Apostasia book. Then my secondary one I'm going after is the pre-wrath rapture, and my fiction book, the fourth and hopefully final volume of The Planet Shaken. Why did God not allow us to create a tower to the heavens, but did allow us to go to the moon? I think that God's allowing man to go to the moon and having that kind of technology, it's just part of the technology curve of the last day that's leading towards a technocracy that's going to control the world. Did Werner von Braun help build NASA? Probably not. Did Werner von Braun help NASA build our rockets and nuclear weapons? Absolutely. Why doesn't the moon rotate? I don't know. You figure that out. Let me know. If we went to the moon, does that mean the moon and the sun is within our firmament? Well, it depends upon what you mean by our firmament. If you mean that it's a piece of metal or plastic that's like a dome over the earth, no. I I don't think there's anything at all to that theory. You can't separate it from the flat earth. Um, if you mean by the firmament, our immediate atmosphere, in other words, our sky or our heaven that's underneath the heavens, no. If you mean if it's in the near heavens, then yes. It really is going to depend upon what you are calling the firmament. Personally, I think the firmament is the that which is around the earth, um, our atmosphere. That's the firmament the birds fly in. Why is the reflected moonlight colder than the shadow of the moonlight on the earth? I have no idea what that question is talking about. Many people claim Neil Armstrong rejected swearing on the Bible proves that they lied about the moon landing. How do you answer this? Many people refuse to swear in the Bible simply because they're either not Christians, or some because they're Christians and they think it's wrong to swear in the Bible. I don't think there's anything in that. What do you think of the claims that our government has built 170 underground cities all interconnected to survive an apocalypse? If we are talking of 170 significant underground shelters, I wouldn't be surprised. We probably got a half dozen absolutely massive ones for the government, and a lot of smaller underground systems for city governments and state governments, um, all connected by underground travel. I'm very skeptical. Some of them are regionally connected. There's no doubt about that. There's connections between the White House and other places nearby, a pretty significant underground system. But all these different sites across the 48 states, all connected by underground rail or underground roads, I'm very skeptical. If God created everything in 7 days, and we believe he won't create anything new besides the new heavens and new earth after the millennium, then where would the water from the flood come from? Well, it says in Genesis, the water from the flood came from two sources. The vast majority of it came from the fountains of the deep. In other words, the earth opened up and the water came out. There's a lot of water underneath the surface of the earth, and it flooded the earth. The minority of it came from the atmosphere around the earth. All the moisture that was in it fell to earth. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. So there was no direct miracle here in the sense of God creating rain that didn't exist. The other thing I would point out, and if you're interested, you can read my book, The New Heavens and New Earth. But I do not believe the new heavens and the new earth come after the 1,000 years. I think that's a mistaken understanding of Revelation 21:1. It's taking one verse in a sense that all the other verses on the new heavens and the new earth contradict. Would you suggest that the evidence is not the issue, but it is a matter of how someone interprets the evidence? I would be very careful with that. I mean, people can misinterpret evidence. But if you make an argument that, for instance, that, let's say we're going to take up the argument of, which one would I want to take up? We go to the moon landing ones here. Let's say we just take up the argument the lack of stars in the sky proves they were fake. Okay, so how are you going to interpret this evidence? Well, this is very easy. You see a picture, there's no stars in the sky, and you say, okay, this proves it's fake. Why does it prove it's fake? Because if they had actually taken a real camera up on the moon and taken a real picture on the moon, they would have seen the stars in the sky. Okay, that's the argument. Now, this is easy to disprove because it's simply a matter of camera exposure. If you took a picture of the night sky here with the same camera exposure settings and aperture settings that they use on the moon, most of the stars in the heavens would not show up in your camera. They just would not, because that camera shutter was closed so far, the aperture was closed so far, and it was open for just a microfraction of a second. You're not going to gather enough light to take a picture. You'll be very, very underexposed. So when it comes to how you interpret the evidence, what you want to make sure that you're doing is you're not being willing to twist the evidence to fit. You need to simply accept the evidence. Um, if there's an explanation for all of the supposed claims against the lunar landing, if every one of them has a common sense understanding, then you just need to set those objections aside. You don't, uh, if any objection has a reasonable understanding, then the objection is set aside. That's how the courts of law work. That's how science works. And if you're going to reject that kind of approach and say, well, I'm going to approach or I'm going to interpret the evidence differently, then you're rejecting the evidence. Okay, Daniel 7:11 and Revelation 19:20. Daniel 7:11. Okay, I beheld because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, and I beheld even till the beast was slain and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. So that there appears to be the Antichrist, the horn, the beast. So let's go to the other one, which is Revelation 19:20. And I believe this is going to be the same reference. Revelation 19:20. The beast was taken and the false prophet, and they were both cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. So I would say, yes, they're talking of the same person. In Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, it sounds like it's describing a demonic army. But Joel 2:11 mentions the Lord. There are two different armies here, heavenly and demonic. No, I think that army from Joel 2, 1 through 10, I think that is describing the heavenly army, not a demonic army. Let's look at some of what is stated in that passage. Okay, so we see it's the day of the Lord in verse 1. Verse 2 says it's dark and gloomy and it's clouds and darkness. Um, then it says a great people and a strong. There has never been any like it, neither shall be any more after it, even to the years of many generations. So this is a mighty army. Now before them a fire devours, and behind them a flame burns. Nothing shall escape them. And then we drop down to verse 6. Before their face the people shall be much pained, and all faces shall gather darkness. Now I want you to think about the context here. We are in the day of the Lord. Notice in verse 10, the earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, the stars shall withdraw their shining. So on that day, there's definitely a demonic army there at Armageddon. But this is not describing the demonic army. This is describing an army that comes down from heaven. Notice verse 8, they shall thrust one another. No, they shall not thrust one another. They shall walk everyone in his path. And when they fall upon the sword, they shall not be wounded. This is not true of the demonic realm. This is not true of any earthly army. This is only true of the glorious resurrected army from heaven. And it says the earth shall quake before them. So the signs in the heavens at the second coming that happen after the tribulation, Matthew 24:29 through 31, these signs happen in the presence of this army descending from heaven. Now, this same army is mentioned in Isaiah 13. They're called the weapons of the Lord's indignation. And notice verse 11, the Lord shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great. Strong is he that executes his word, for the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. So I think Joel 2, 1 through 11 here is talking about the army of heaven that's in Revelation 19. Okay, who's the host in Daniel 8, verses 10, 11, and 13? Okay. It waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. And verse 11 is the prince of the host. And verse 13, trampled underfoot. Okay. So in verse 11, or in verse 10, we have the little horn waxed great to the host of heaven and cast down some of the host and the stars of the ground. I think this is the same thing that we see in Revelation, where the sign of the great dragon and 1/3 of the stars are going to fall to earth. This is a sign in the last days, and this is mentioned here. And in verse 11, now verse 10, the host is talking about the host of heaven. Now, the host is used in scripture of the host of the stars. It's also used of an army. So the stars is one host, earthly armies are another host, the army of heaven is another host. Here we have the prince of the host. I think this is the Lord of hosts. So that's how I would look at that passage. We got the host in the heavens, and then we have the heavenly host that's led by the Lord. Okay, I think we're running out of questions. All right. Well, hopefully, I've given folks some food for thought here. As I said earlier, methodology is my whole concern, my number one concern. We really want to always have in our mind to gather all the information on the subject and weigh it all fairly, whether we're dealing with a biblical subject or a scientific subject or a subject of history. If we do this and we're consistent with it, we're going to increase the odds that we're going to be right on the subjects we take up. The more we stray from this and we favor partial evidence, we're going to make mistakes. And I probably did offend a few tonight because I speak fairly strongly against the flat Earth and the King James only, and things like the lunar landing hoax. But I absolutely believe that this is an issue that we can know for sure, that we ought to know for sure. This is not something that's merely a matter of opinion. I mean, I wish that it were. We talk that way at times. This is really a matter of saying yes to evidence or no to evidence. And um, I think the evidence is very, very strong that we went to the moon, and that the evidences that we didn't go to the moon are really not evidences. They're just difficulties that people find. And those difficulties all have ready answers. And if the difficulties have ready answers, then history is vindicated until someone comes up with absolute, undeniable proof that history is wrong. And nobody's made any kind of an effort for that kind of proof. I personally, I don't expect that anyone ever will. I don't think the evidence is out there, but if someone brought it forth, I would definitely weigh the evidence. If we dug up several hundred classified papers from the Pentagon and the White House and NASA, uh, and a couple whistleblowers out of Hollywood that were 90 years old came forth, and some 50 Russians came forth, and a pile of Russian documents came forth, and then thousands of whistleblowers came forth and said, "Yeah, I was told if I talked about the satellite, I'd be shot." We start seeing stuff like this. yeah, then we've got some real evidence. Until we have that kind of evidence, we don't have any evidence at all. So this is just really a matter of evidence. And hopefully I've encouraged you on being an evidence-based, fact-based student. We're living in an age, folks, and I didn't get into this in the program because it's almost like it's its own thing. But we're living in an age when people can't tell the difference between investigation and doubt. Um, to me, this is huge. If you can't tell the difference, you're already going on the wrong path. If you're going to investigate stuff, you weigh all the evidence on both sides, you give it a fair hearing. If you are going down the path of doubt, you start doubting the moon landing. That's where you start. And then you demand that we have to prove that we went to the moon. And you've already given favor to the doubts. And it's really reversed. The burden of proof is not on us to prove that we went to the moon. That's just been an understood, well protected, well proven point of history with no significant evidence in the last 50 years of history that would withstand it. It's just like everybody knows, except the doubters. So the burden of proof is on the doubters. And that's why we need to understand the difference between investigation and doubting. There's a lot of people today, there's these big waves of doubt flowing through the church. And it's like doubt is the greatest sign that you're a deep thinker. If you doubt the moon landing, you're a deep thinker, you're an independent thinker. If you doubt the round earth, you're a deep thinker. If uh you know you there's just everything is doubt. You there's things you have to believe that you require a bunch of doubt to believe it. And I just don't like the doubt path. I want to be facts based. And so I just encourage you, stick with facts. Just run with the facts. And don't be swayed by these big waves of doubt. Let those waves come crashing in. Just stay calm, sober, rational. Don't worry about them. And just calmly weigh the facts. You know, I find it interesting that when these waves of doubt come rolling through the church, it's not infrequent that people will bring the subject up and admit that they're influenced by the doubts. And you challenge them to actually weigh the evidence, and they don't have the time to weigh the evidence. They're not going to do it. And to me, this is sad. It's also dangerous, because if you just are part of the problem, sowing the doubt, and you refuse to weigh the evidence and get to the bottom of it, you are sowing division in the church on an issue that should never have been allowed to take root in the church in the first place. If the evangelical church had been evidence-based entirely from the get-go on every issue they dealt with, and we were solidly, consistently, powerfully evidence-driven, we wouldn't have big divisions like we do, where people have left the dispensational camp for pre-wrath and post-trib. We wouldn't have the big divisions we're having, where people are leaving dispensationalism and going to the Hebrew roots. And we wouldn't have these big divisions with King James only and flat earth and lunar landing denials, because we would be so evidence-based and so evidence-fixed that these issues wouldn't be able to take root. These issues only take root where people are in an environment that's not evidence-based. And the first time someone comes along and throws evidence at them with a bunch of passion, they believe it and they go running off down the rabbit hole. And so they went from mouthing the truth without evidence, not evidence-based, hear a powerful argument with a powerful display of evidence, and they get convinced of some rabbit hole. And then when the truth comes back with evidence, they're already married to the 10-pound pile of evidence, and they don't want the 1,000-pound of evidence. And that's what we're dealing with. So, folks, just be evidence-based. It's fine if you say, I don't have time to weigh this today, but I will someday. That's okay. It's fine if you say you're confused. It's fine to be confused, as long as you're not married to something other than the evidence. I just want to encourage people to be married to the evidence. The evidence on a doctrinal issue is all the testimony in the Bible on the subject, all of it, not quarter of it or half of it, all of it. The evidence on an issue like this is the entire pile of evidence on the matter, including the historical evidence that you poo-poo to go down the rabbit hole. So just be evidence-based. That's the moral of the story for tonight. Well, I've gone on long enough on this. I could probably continue to talk for 20 minutes, but all I would say is the same thing again from 3 or 4 different angles. I probably should wind this night up, do a little reading before I go to bed. And folks, thank you for hanging with me. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. Thank you, all my moderators, for sticking with me tonight. And may you all be blessed. Keep your eyes on the prize in the skies.